The note was 4 sentences long. I know that because I counted them. Sitting on the kitchen floor at 6:40 in the evening, still in my work jacket, I read those 4 sentences 11 times. My name is Daniel, and that piece of paper, torn from the back of a grocery list, written in blue ballpoint, was the last real communication I would receive from my wife for almost a year. I remember the exact texture of that moment. The kitchen smelled like the morning's coffee, still faintly warm in the air, and the late autumn light came through the window at a low angle that made the dust on the countertop visible. Everything was in its place. The ceramic bowl where Emily kept her keys was empty. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked in, not the note, which was propped against the fruit bowl, but the empty ceramic dish. Her keys were always there. A small brass ring with a fabric sunflower charm she'd bought at a street market 3 summers ago. Gone. I set my bag down slowly, the way you move when some part of you already knows something is wrong but another part is still insisting on normal. I picked up the note. I read it once. Then again. I need space. I'm not okay and I haven't been for a while. This isn't about you. Please don't call me right away, I need time to think. I'm sorry. 4 sentences. No last name. No explanation. Just Emily's small, looping handwriting and the word sorry sitting at the end like a period that wasn't heavy enough to hold everything it was supposed to. I stood there until the light changed. The dust on the counter disappeared as the sun dropped below the tree line outside, and the kitchen went gray and quiet. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I think I was waiting for her to come back through the door and tell me she'd forgotten something, her phone, her coat, some reason that made sense. She didn't come back. To understand how I got to that kitchen floor, you'd have to go back about 8 months. Not to any single event, there wasn't a clean beginning, no moment I could point to and say, there, that's where it started. Betrayal doesn't announce itself. It arrives the way water damage does, slowly, behind the walls, invisible until the ceiling caves. Emily and I had been married for 6 years when the note appeared. We met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, the kind of casual evening where you don't expect anything to happen and then someone laughs at the wrong moment and you look up and something shifts. She had dark hair she wore pulled back when she was concentrating on something, and she talked with her hands when she got excited, and by the end of that dinner I'd already decided I wanted to have more evenings like that one. We dated for 2 years before we got married. Bought the house a year after the wedding, a modest place in a quiet neighborhood, with a porch that needed repainting and a backyard we'd made vague plans to do something beautiful with, though we never quite got around to it. I worked a steady job in project management for a mid-sized logistics firm. Not glamorous, but solid, the kind of work that pays the mortgage and leaves enough room for a decent life. Emily worked in marketing, and she was good at it. Sharp, creative, the kind of person who could walk into a room and within 20 minutes understand exactly what it needed. For most of those 6 years, I believed we were happy. Not a movie version of happy, not constant electricity and grand gestures, but the real kind. The kind where you know each other's coffee order and you don't need to fill every silence and you feel safe. I felt safe with her. That was the word I would have used. Safe. Looking back now, I understand that I confused safe with static. And the difference between those two things is where everything eventually broke apart. But at 6:40 on a Thursday evening in November, I didn't know any of that. I just knew the ceramic dish was empty, and the note had 4 sentences, and the house had never felt so large. I called her. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Same. I sat on the kitchen floor and I waited, because I didn't know what else to do, and some part of me, the part that still believed in the life we had built, was convinced this was a misunderstanding that would be explained by morning. It wasn't. The weeks before the note, I had been telling myself a story. It was a convincing story, I'd been working on it for months without realizing that's what I was doing. The story went like this: Emily was stressed at work. The new account she'd taken on was difficult, the hours were longer than usual, and she was the kind of person who internalized pressure rather than releasing it. The distance I'd been feeling between us was temporary. The way she'd stopped asking about my day wasn't indifference, it was exhaustion. The laughter that had slowly drained from our evenings wasn't gone, it was just resting. I told myself this story because it was easier than the alternative. And because I was good at it. I'd been good at it for longer than I want to admit. The first sign I chose not to read came in early spring, about 7 months before the note. We were cooking dinner together, something we used to do most evenings, a habit that had started early in our marriage and that I'd always quietly loved. She was chopping vegetables and I was telling her about a problem at work, some scheduling conflict that had turned into a small crisis, and I looked up mid-sentence and realized she wasn't listening. Not in the distracted way of someone whose mind had briefly wandered. She was somewhere else entirely. Her eyes were focused on the cutting board, but her expression was the one she wore when she was solving a problem internally, something contained and private that I wasn't part of. I stopped talking. A beat passed. She looked up. "Sorry, what did you say?" "Nothing," I said. "Never mind." I remember telling myself she was tired. And maybe she was. But that moment, the cutting board, the absent expression, the way she didn't even register that I'd stopped mid-sentence, I filed it somewhere I didn't examine. That was the first red flag I walked past without stopping. I named it exhaustion, and I moved on. Through spring and into early summer, the distance grew in increments small enough that I kept adjusting to each one before noticing the cumulative effect. She started going to bed earlier, or at least going upstairs while I was still in the living room, claiming tiredness in a tone that didn't invite conversation. Weekend mornings, which had once been slow and unhurried, coffee on the porch, half-read newspapers, the comfortable silence of people who don't need to perform for each other, became shorter. She was up earlier. Out on errands I hadn't heard mentioned the night before. Back with coffee cups from a place I didn't recognize. I noticed the coffee cups. Once, twice, then a handful of times. A green logo I didn't know, from a cafe I'd never been to. I asked her about it once, casually, genuinely curious, and she said it was a new place near the office, good coffee, she'd started stopping there on the way in. "You should try it," she said, and smiled. I never did. But I thought about those cups more than I should have, which tells me that somewhere beneath the story I was telling myself, I already knew the cups meant something. The evenings changed too. Not dramatically, there was no single night when everything flipped. But the quality of the air between us shifted. Dinners became shorter. Conversations became transactional, logistics, groceries, small household items that needed attention. She started checking her phone more frequently, placing it face down on the table when she set it down, which was a small adjustment I registered without consciously processing. I didn't ask about the phone. I told myself it was work. And the thing is, that wasn't entirely unreasonable. She had always been connected to work in the evenings. But there's a difference between the way someone checks messages about a campaign deadline and the way someone checks messages they're waiting for. I knew that difference. I just chose not to name it. One evening in late June I came home to find her on the back porch, phone to her ear, laughing. It was a real laugh, unguarded, full, the kind I hadn't heard directed at me in months. She didn't notice me through the glass door at first, and I stood in the kitchen watching her for a few seconds. She was animated. Leaning forward, one hand gesturing, the way she always did when she was genuinely engaged with something. When she saw me through the glass she straightened slightly, and the laugh softened, and she said something brief into the phone and hung up. "Who was that?" I asked when she came inside. "Just someone from work," she said. "The Brian situation, they needed some input on the campaign." Brian. The name landed without weight. I had no reason to attach anything to it. She mentioned colleagues in passing all the time, I didn't track them. I nodded and went to the refrigerator and poured myself a glass of water, and the evening continued. I wouldn't think about that name again for months. July brought a new pattern. Thursday evenings, she started staying later at the office. Once, then twice, then consistently. Team dinners, she called them. The new account apparently required relationship building with the client, which meant late meals and after-dinner drinks in the city. She came home sometime after 10 on those nights, tired but not unhappy, sometimes smelling of wine. I never went to sleep before she got home. I don't know exactly why, habit or something more instinctive that I wasn't naming. I'd be in the living room with a book or the television on low, and she'd come in and we'd exchange a few sentences and she'd go upstairs. One Thursday in the second week of August, I know the date because it was the evening after a project milestone I'd been working toward for weeks, she came home and I was still awake, and when she leaned down to say goodnight I caught it. A faint trace under the wine, under her perfume. Something woody and unfamiliar. The kind of scent that clings from close contact. Another man's cologne. I remember sitting very still after she went upstairs. The television was murmuring. The room felt different in a way I couldn't articulate, like the air had a new texture. Even now, thinking back to that moment, I feel the way the room seemed to contract slightly. I didn't confront her. I didn't follow her upstairs. I sat there and I consciously chose the explanation that hurt least, a client meeting, someone who'd stood too close, meaningless proximity. I chose it the way you choose not to look at something directly because you're afraid of what you'll see in the light. That was the second red flag. And the night I crossed the line between not knowing and choosing not to know. September arrived and brought with it the particular anxiety of a man who has started paying attention. I began noticing things I'd been moving past for months. The phone, always face down. The slight hesitation before she answered simple questions. Where are you going? When will you be back? A half-second pause that had no reason to be there. The way she sometimes came home and went straight upstairs to shower before dinner, which she'd never done before. Small rituals of erasure that I catalogued without yet understanding what I was cataloging. I started checking things I wasn't proud of checking. Not her phone, I never touched her phone, but other peripherals. The mileage when she returned from what should have been a short errand. The timestamps on emails she'd mentioned in passing. The texture of explanations that should have been simple but somehow required more architecture than they needed. One Saturday morning she told me she was going to meet a friend from university, someone named Kara, who I knew vaguely from photos and occasional mentions. She left around 11 and came back around 4, carrying a small shopping bag with the name of a boutique I didn't recognize. She showed me a scarf she'd bought. It was beautiful, deep green, soft. I held it and agreed it was beautiful. 3 days later, by accident, I ran into something that unsettled me. I was using the shared family laptop to find a restaurant reservation I'd made weeks earlier, and in the browser history, which neither of us had ever thought to clear, because we'd never needed to, I saw a search she'd run that same Saturday. Not a search for shops. Not a search for anything related to a friend. A search for a hotel. In the city. With reviews filtered by private parking and discreet check-in. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I closed the laptop. That was the moment. Not a suspicion anymore, something had calcified. I could feel it in my chest, heavy and cold, like swallowing something that wouldn't go down. And yet I still didn't act. I told myself there could be a dozen explanations. I told myself I didn't have proof. What I was actually doing was buying time, because confirmation would mean the end of a life I wasn't ready to leave. The hotel search haunted the next 2 weeks. I replayed the Saturday in my head, her easy demeanor when she came home, the scarf, the shopping bag. She'd been calm. No visible guilt, no nervousness. Either she was an accomplished liar, or I was misreading everything. I chose to believe the latter. For 2 more weeks, I chose it daily, consciously, with increasing effort. The Thursday evenings continued into October. But something changed in the quality of them. She started texting me earlier on those nights, running late, don't wait up, with a precision that felt managed. As if the communication itself was a kind of cover, a way of making the absence feel normal through announcement. I started staying awake later. Not to confront her when she came in, I told myself I wasn't doing that, but because sleep had become difficult and the house felt strange in a way it hadn't before. I'd lie in bed with the lamp off and listen to the particular silence of a house that's waiting for something, and my mind would move through the same architecture of doubt again and again. One night I got up around midnight and went downstairs for water. I passed through the dark living room and something on the coffee table caught the ambient light from the street, her phone, which she'd left charging. Face up, for once. I didn't touch it. I stood 3 feet away and looked at it and I felt the pull, the terrible, clarifying pull of wanting to know and hating myself for wanting it. A notification lit the screen briefly. Not enough to read. Just enough to see that there was something there. I went to the kitchen. Got my water. Came back through the living room and went upstairs without touching the phone. I've thought about that moment many times. Not with pride, there was nothing noble about leaving the phone alone. I left it because I was afraid. Afraid of what I'd find, yes. But more afraid of who I'd become in the act of looking, the kind of husband who went through his wife's phone in the dark. I wasn't ready to be that person. So I let the question stay open, because an open question is still survivable. That was the night I realized something had fundamentally shifted in how I experienced our home. It wasn't a place I felt safe anymore. It had become a place I was investigating without admitting I was investigating it, reading the air, cataloging silences, treating ordinary objects as evidence. I was already inside the end of our marriage. I just hadn't acknowledged it yet. In late October, about 2 weeks before she left, there was one evening that stood apart from the others. She came home on a regular Tuesday, not a Thursday, no stated reason to be out, later than expected. Dinner was on the table and cooling when she walked in. She apologized, said she'd gotten caught up at the office, and sat down and ate. Normal enough. But her energy was different that evening. Not the flat, retreating kind I'd grown used to. She was present, more than she'd been in months. She asked me about my project. She laughed at something I said. She touched my hand once, briefly, across the table. I remember sitting across from her and feeling something crack open, hope, the most painful emotion in this kind of situation because it costs the most when it turns out to be wrong. I thought, maybe I've been misreading everything. Maybe this is turning around. After dinner she helped clear the table, which she hadn't done in a while, and when I was washing up she came and stood beside me and leaned her head briefly against my shoulder. I went still. She moved away after a moment, said she was tired, and went upstairs. I stood at the sink with the water running and tried to understand what had just happened. Now I think I understand it. That evening wasn't a turning back, it was a goodbye. Not a conscious one, maybe. But when someone is about to leave, sometimes something in them reaches back one last time. Not to reconsider. Just to remember. She was saying goodbye and I was reading it as reconnection, and that gap between what she meant and what I understood, that was the loneliness of the whole situation in one moment. 2 weeks later, she was gone. She had been gone for 3 days before I told anyone. I moved through those first 72 hours in a strange fog, going to work, coming home, standing in the kitchen with the note still on the counter because I couldn't bring myself to move it. I ate cereal standing up. I didn't change the pillowcase on her side of the bed. I kept her keys dish on the shelf where it had always sat, empty. On the 4th day I called my friend Marcus. We'd known each other since college, the kind of friendship that doesn't require much maintenance because the foundation is solid. He came over that evening and I told him everything, the note, the months of distance, the cologne, the hotel search, the way she'd leaned her head on my shoulder 2 weeks before she disappeared. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and listened without interrupting, which was exactly what I needed. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Have you tried reaching her again?" "Every day the first week," I said. Voicemail. She texted once, said she needed more time and would reach out when she was ready. "Do you want me to help you find out what's actually going on?" I thought about it. Really thought about it. Part of me wanted to investigate, to hire someone, to dig, to find the proof I was already fairly certain existed. But another part of me recoiled from it. If I went looking and found what I suspected, it would transform a painful ambiguity into a confirmed catastrophe. And somewhere beneath the logic, I still believed that Emily would come back and explain, and the explanation would somehow be survivable. "Not yet," I said. Marcus nodded. He didn't push. He stayed another 2 hours, we talked about other things, and when he left he said, "Call me when you're ready to stop waiting." I waited 4 more months. The waiting had its own strange shape. The first month was the worst, a constant low-grade alertness, phone always nearby, the specific agony of checking for messages that didn't come. I learned to stop expecting her texts and start just existing alongside the silence, which is a different skill than I'd expected to need at this point in my life. I thought about Brian occasionally, the name she'd mentioned on the back porch that June evening, the phone call she'd cut short when she saw me. I turned the name over sometimes, the way you press a bruise to gauge how deep it goes. But I had no evidence beyond a name and a feeling, and I was aware enough of my own psychological state to know that I was capable of constructing a story around very little. One evening in late January, about 10 weeks after she'd left, I was cleaning out the coat closet, doing the slow work of reorganizing 2 people's belongings when one person has gone, and I found a receipt in the pocket of a jacket Emily had left behind. A restaurant receipt. Date, September 14th. A place in the city I knew by name but had never been to, the kind of restaurant you go to for an occasion. The bill was for 2 people. The items: 2 glasses of wine, 2 main courses, 1 shared dessert. September 14th was a Thursday. I sat down on the closet floor and held the receipt and breathed carefully. "Team dinners," she'd said. "Client relationship building." And it could still be that, a dinner with a client, a colleague, nothing more. I turned the receipt over. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, a jotted note, a few words in ballpoint. Not Emily's handwriting. Saturday, same place? I stayed on the closet floor for a long time. That was the moment the story I'd been telling myself became structurally impossible. Not because of what the note said, but because of what it meant. I had been managing uncertainty for months, filing everything under the most bearable explanation. But a receipt with another person's handwriting on the back doesn't have a bearable explanation. It has only one. I put the receipt in a small box on my desk. I didn't throw it away. I didn't call anyone. I just put it in the box and went to bed and lay in the dark and let myself, finally, consider the thing I had been refusing to consider. The following weeks I started moving through the house differently, not looking for evidence exactly, but no longer avoiding it. I was paying a different quality of attention. I found small things, a contact saved in our shared tablet under just an initial, which I hadn't noticed before. A pattern in the shared calendar where her Thursday evenings had been marked as team going back to April, months earlier than I'd registered. A set of photographs deleted from her cloud account, the album visible but empty, the title still there, Spring. None of it was definitive on its own. Together it was the texture of a life being conducted in parallel, not hidden perfectly, but hidden well enough for a husband who didn't want to look too hard. I didn't hire an investigator. I didn't go through her social media or attempt to contact Brian. I didn't even know his last name. What I did, slowly and quietly, was build a picture from what was already there, the things she'd left behind, the patterns I'd ignored, the timeline of a marriage that had been hollowing out from the inside while the outside kept its shape. By March, 4 months after she'd left, I had built the case I'd been avoiding. Not a legal case. Not something I could present to anyone. Just the private, devastating knowledge of what had actually been happening in my own home. I called Marcus. "I'm ready," I said. "Ready for what?" he asked. "To stop waiting," I said. "I'm going to file." There was a silence. Then, "Okay. I'll come over." I never filed. Not because I changed my mind, but because 2 days after that conversation, an email arrived. The subject line was, "I owe you the truth." I stared at it in my inbox for almost an hour before I opened it. Her email was 3 paragraphs long. In the first, she apologized, not in the vague, self-protective way of someone managing blame, but with a specificity that surprised me. She named what she'd done, the affair, the lies, the deliberate distance she'd maintained to make leaving easier. She didn't use soft language. She didn't say I made mistakes or things got complicated. She said, "I was unfaithful to you, and I hid it, and I left because I was a coward." In the second paragraph she said she needed to tell me something in person. That there was something she couldn't put in an email. That she knew she had no right to ask anything of me, but she was asking anyway. The third paragraph was just one line, "Please." I wouldn't be asking if it wasn't important. I read it 4 times. Then I closed my laptop and went for a long walk in the cold March air and tried to decide what to do with the fact that after almost 5 months of silence, Emily had chosen this moment and these words to reappear. I could have ignored it. Part of me wanted to, the part that had spent months quietly dismantling my attachment to a future I'd believed in, brick by brick, and wasn't certain I could survive rebuilding it only to have it destroyed again. But I wasn't built for unanswered questions. I never had been. And the phrase "it wouldn't be asking if it wasn't important" had landed somewhere I couldn't dislodge it from. I replied, "1 hour. Coffee. You pick the place." She chose a cafe downtown, neutral territory, public enough to prevent a scene, small enough to feel private. I arrived first and took a corner table and ordered a black coffee I didn't drink. I watched the door. She came in 7 minutes late. She looked different, not dramatically, but in the small ways people change when they've been through something. She was thinner. Her hair was shorter. She moved with a kind of careful composure that I recognized as the external architecture of someone who has been practicing what they're about to say. She sat down. We looked at each other. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You said it was important." A short silence. She wrapped both hands around the mug the server brought, though I hadn't seen her order anything. "Daniel." She stopped. Started again. "I told you in the email what I did. I'm not going to dress it up. Brian was a colleague and it went on for about 8 months. From April to when I left in November. I told myself different things about what it meant, but what it was a betrayal. I know that. I said nothing. I had no prepared speech. I'd decided on the walk over that I would just listen. I left because I was ashamed and because I didn't know how to be in the same room as you while carrying what I'd done. I told myself you'd be better off not knowing, which was the most selfish thought I've ever had, and I've had time to understand that. She looked at her hands. "I need to tell you something that I found out a few weeks ago." Her voice changed, not breaking, but shifting, moving into a register that was lower and more careful. "I'm pregnant." The room didn't change. The ambient noise of the cafe continued, cutlery, a conversation at a nearby table, the hiss of a milk steamer. I heard all of it with strange clarity. "How far along?" I heard myself ask. "About 4 months." The math arrived before she said the next part. "I don't know," she started. "It could be Brian's. Or it could be yours. The timing," she stopped again. "The timing means I genuinely don't know, Daniel. And I'm telling you because you have the right to know. I'm not asking you for anything. Her voice fractured slightly, the composure she'd arrived with showing its edges. I couldn't not tell you. There are moments that exist outside the normal experience of time. That conversation was one of them. I felt my chest do something complicated, something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite something else. It was the sensation of a life reorganizing itself around new information, which is not a comfortable feeling. It's more like falling than like understanding. I looked at her across the small cafe table and I thought about 6 years of dinners and weekends and the porch we never repainted and the backyard we never finished. I thought about the note on 4 sentences on the kitchen counter. I thought about sitting on the closet floor with the restaurant receipt. And I thought, even now, even here, I don't fully recognize her. That was the most disorienting part. Not the pregnancy. Not even the affair. The fact that this woman sitting across from me, whom I had shared a bed with, whom I had loved, whom I had believed was my best friend, had been living a life I'd had no access to. And I had been in the same house. I had been 5 feet away. What does Brian say? I asked. My voice was calm. I was almost surprised. She looked up. He doesn't know. We're not together. It ended before I sent you the email. A beat. He chose his family, she said quietly. He went back to his wife. I registered the full architecture of that information. Brian, the affair partner, he had his own wife. Which meant Emily had not been the only person operating a double life under this story. There was a whole other household, another person on the far side of this wreckage. And somehow that detail, the specificity of it, the weight of how many ordinary lives had been quietly dismantled, made the entire situation feel more real and more terrible than anything else she'd said. I stood up. I need to process this, I said. I'm not going to give you a reaction right now. I'm going to leave, and I'm going to think, and I'll contact you when I'm ready. She nodded. She didn't try to stop me. She said, I understand. Then, I'm sorry, Daniel. I know that's not enough. I walked out into the March air and kept walking until the cold cleared my head. 2 weeks later I received the DNA test results. I had agreed, through a text exchange with Emily, to undergo testing once the baby was born. She'd suggested it, I hadn't needed to ask. In the meantime I had spoken to a lawyer about my options, not to plan a strategy, but simply to understand the landscape. What it meant if the child was mine. What it meant if she wasn't. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at my desk at work. The child was mine. I sat with that for a long time after I hung up. Not relief exactly. Not grief. Something more complex, the recognition that fatherhood had arrived in the least expected shape, through the most painful route, and that the feelings I had about that were not simple and probably never would be. I called Emily that evening. She's mine, I said. A long silence. Then I heard her exhale. Yes, she said softly. I want to be her father, I said. That's not conditional on anything between us. I want to be in her life. Another silence. When Emily spoke again, her voice was different, not relieved, not grateful, but something quieter than both of those. Something that sounded like a person finally letting themselves believe that one thing, at least one thing, had not been entirely destroyed. Okay, she said. She was born in late June. I was in the waiting room, not the delivery room, we hadn't gotten there yet in terms of what we were to each other, and a nurse came out and said she was here and she was healthy and asked if I wanted to come through. She was smaller than I'd expected. That's the first thing I remember thinking. Wrapped in a pale yellow blanket, her face scrunched against the light, her hands in tiny fists. Emily was watching me from the bed when I came in. I didn't look at Emily. I looked at her. I'm still not sure what I felt in that moment. There was love, sudden and structurally complete in a way I hadn't anticipated, like it had been built in the dark while I wasn't paying attention and arrived fully formed. There was grief, too, a grief for what this child would have had if things had been different. And underneath both of those, something harder to name, a kind of reckoning. This person, this small, blinking, brand new person, was the living consequence of every choice and mistake and evasion that had led to this room. She hadn't asked for any of it. She was just here. And I was here. And I decided, standing at the side of that hospital bed, that whatever else I was going to do with the rest of my life, being her father was going to be the most honest thing in it. We named her Clara. Emily chose it, I agreed. It felt right, something clear and uncomplicated in the middle of all the complexity. The co-parenting arrangement came together over the following months, slowly and imperfectly, the way things do when two people are navigating shared responsibility without the map of an intact relationship. We didn't fight, that surprised me, actually. I had braced for arguments, for the particular bitterness of a failed marriage being hashed out through negotiation. What we had instead was more like a careful, formal cooperation, two people who had once been close trying to find a working distance. Emily moved into an apartment across the city. I kept the house, though I wasn't sure for how long. It was large for one person, and the room still held the particular silence of someone recently gone. I repapered the kitchen. That was the first thing I did, the first deliberate change, pulled down the wallpaper Emily had chosen when we moved in and put up something clean and plain. Not dramatic. Just different. Clara came to me on Wednesday evenings and alternating weekends. The first time Emily dropped her off, we stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, both of us aware of the strangeness, the house, the version of this we hadn't planned for, the child between us who looked at the world with enormous, uncomplicated eyes. She smiled today for the first time, Emily said. This morning. I thought you should know. Thank you for telling me. She nodded. She handed over the bag with Clara's things, the small rituals of transfer, the logistics of shared parenthood. She was halfway down the path when she stopped. Daniel. I waited. I know there's nothing I can say. But I hope, she paused. I hope you find something good. You deserve something good. I didn't answer. I wasn't sure what answer I had. I watched her walk to her car, and I carried Clara inside, and I stood in the newly repapered kitchen and held my daughter and let the house be quiet around us. The months after Clara's birth changed me in ways I'm still in the process of understanding. There is a specific kind of grief that comes from losing a future you believed in, not a person, not an event, but a version of your life that felt certain. I had believed in our life. I had believed in the house, the backyard, the vague beautiful plans, the slow accumulation of years. Losing that is different from losing a person. It's quieter and more pervasive, because there is no single moment of loss, just the gradual understanding that you have been living in a story that wasn't entirely real. I spent a long time thinking about what I'd missed. The coffee cups from the cafe I never went to. The phone face down on the table. The way she laughed on the back porch that June evening, unguarded and full in a way she hadn't been with me in months. Each of those details, reviewed in hindsight, had its own clear meaning. At the time I read them as minor data points in a story about a stressed and distracted wife. Now I understand they were the visible edges of a separate life she was building. And the hardest part isn't the betrayal itself, it's the recognition of how much work I put into not seeing it. Marcus said something to me once, during those months, that I've thought about often. We were sitting on the porch with beers in the early autumn, Clara was asleep inside, and he said, "You know what's interesting about you? You're not angry at her. You're angry at yourself." He wasn't entirely wrong. The anger at Emily had come and gone, hot at first, then cooler, then something flatter and more manageable. What remained was a more complicated feeling, the discomfort of a man who had been a willing participant in his own blindness. I had seen the signs. I had named them wrong. Not because I was stupid, but because denial, when you choose it carefully, can look almost identical to trust. And that was the lesson I couldn't teach myself gently. Trust and denial look the same from the inside. Both feel like choosing to believe in someone. The difference is only visible from the outside, or in retrospect. I had been choosing denial for months and calling it loyalty. There is a Wednesday evening, about 6 months into the co-parenting arrangement, that I come back to often. Clara was in the living room, propped against the cushions, not yet walking but watching everything with the specific intensity of a person learning what the world is. I was on the floor beside her, and she grabbed my finger in her hand, the way babies do, and held on with that absolute, unconscious grip. No agenda. No ambivalence. Just the pure physical fact of holding. I sat there for a long time. The house was quiet. The evening light came through the window at the same low autumn angle it had come through on the night I read the note, the same kitchen, the same direction, the same hour. But everything else was different. The ceramic dish was still on the shelf, still empty, but I'd stopped seeing it as absence. It was just a dish. The house wasn't large and hollow anymore. It had reorganized itself around something new. I thought about what I would tell Clara someday, not the specifics, not the version with all its weight, but something true and simple that a person could carry. Maybe that love is real and also insufficient sometimes. That people do harm through cowardice as often as through cruelty. That fatherhood, for me, arrived wrapped in the most painful experience of my adult life and became the most clarifying one. I looked at her. She looked at me. She released my finger and immediately grabbed it again. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know if I would stay in this house or sell it. I didn't know if I would file the divorce papers that were sitting in a folder on my desk or whether something in me was still waiting for a clarity that hadn't fully arrived. I didn't know what Emily and I were to each other now, something past marriage, something before reconciliation, something that probably didn't have a clean name. But Clara had my finger, and the light was good, and the house was quiet. That was enough for that evening. What makes this story difficult to file neatly into the category of betrayal narrative is that the most damaging thing Emily did was not the affair itself. It was the slow, deliberate withdrawal, the months of managed distance, that came before she left. The affair was a conclusion. The damage was done in the architecture of silences and small evasions that preceded it, the daily decisions to retreat rather than speak. By the time she walked out with that 4-sentence note, the marriage had already been abandoned for months. She had simply made it official. What's revealing about Daniel's experience is the particular way he responded to that withdrawal. He didn't confront it. He domesticated it, transformed each red flag into a more bearable explanation, filed every piece of uncomfortable evidence under the most forgiving interpretation available. This is not a failure of intelligence or perception. He was clearly a man capable of noticing things. It was a failure of willingness. He was not willing to know, because knowing would require acting, and acting would require accepting that the life he believed in had already ended. There is a psychological mechanism at work here that is worth naming precisely. When a person has invested deeply in a relationship, when their sense of safety and identity is tightly bound to its continuity, the mind will do extraordinary work to preserve the status quo. Daniel's denial was not passive. It was active. It took effort, daily, to look at the cologne on her clothes and choose the explanation that cost him nothing. This is what might be called the cost of comfort, the tremendous energy expended in maintaining a bearable fiction, energy that could have gone toward confronting a painful truth and beginning to heal. Emily, for her part, was operating inside her own self-deception. The story she told herself was that she needed freedom, that the stability of the marriage felt like a cage. But freedom, as she understood it, was not a direction she moved toward. It was a thing she took from a life that was already built, from a person who had done nothing wrong except be reliably present. The affair with Brian, who returned to his own wife when the situation became consequential, was not liberation. It was an escape route that collapsed the moment it was expected to bear weight. What the DNA result introduced, and what the narrative handles with unusual restraint, is the question of what it means to choose fatherhood under these conditions. Daniel did not choose Clara despite what Emily had done. He chose her independently of it. That distinction matters. It suggests a capacity to separate love from its circumstances, to recognize that a child's existence is not reducible to the failures of the people who brought her into being. There is a kind of moral clarity in that decision that runs against the grain of the emotional devastation surrounding it. The ending, open, unresolved, quiet, is perhaps the most honest element of the story. Life after a betrayal of this depth doesn't resolve cleanly. It reorganizes. Daniel is not healed, he is reorganized. The house is the same house, the light falls through the same window, but the meaning of those things has changed. He has not arrived at peace so much as at a different and more sustainable relationship with uncertainty. He holds his daughter's hand, and he doesn't know what comes next, and that, the honest not knowing, is the truest ending the story could have. The story ultimately says something about the relationship between stability and stagnation, and how easily one can masquerade as the other from the inside. Emily experienced the marriage as a kind of stillness she mistook for suffocation. Daniel experienced it as safety he mistook for permanence. They were both wrong in symmetrical ways, and the cost of those parallel misreadings was everything they had built together, and one small person who arrived in the wreckage and became, for Daniel at least, the reason to keep building. What stays with me about this story isn't the betrayal itself, it's the gap between what was believed and what was real. Two people, living in the same house, and one of them was somewhere else entirely. The other one looked at the evidence every day and chose a different story. That's the part one can't easily let go of. Because I think most of us have done that at some point, chosen the version of events that costs us less in the short term, and told ourselves it was trust. There's a difference, though, isn't there? Real trust is open-eyed. It sees the concerning thing and considers it and then decides, with full information, to believe. What Daniel had was something quieter and more frightened than that. And the hardest kind of growth is learning to tell the two apart before the ceiling caves.